Good morning. This is the Mack Road Church of Christ Sunday Samuel to Chronicle study. We're in 1 Samuel chapter 5. If you need to contact me, there's my information there. I want to remind you of this chart that I always use to just kind of give us an overview of the book of Samuel. Since it's a historical book, we can do that and have a pretty good idea of what's going on. I remember that we're in the first 8 chapters of the book of Samuel, when Samuel is a prophet, priest, and a judge. We just finished talking about Eli, who passed away in the last part of chapter 4, which brings us to chapter 5. And the reason that he died was because the Ark of the Covenant had been taken captive by the Philistines. And we hadn't heard of the Philistines until this battle that they had. But the Philistines were a maritime nation that basically would conquer people by coming on shore and getting a foothold on the beaches and the shorelines, and then move inland a little bit as they would go in and they would conquer different nations and use them for tribute and those kind of things. And that's probably what we have going on here. As we know in the book of Judges, certainly we understand that whenever Israel became sinful, God would allow them to be subjugated by another nation until they repented and turned back to God, and then God would bring a judge and deliver them. And so that's probably what's going on here. The Philistines had captured and had subjugated part of Israel, especially the part where Shiloh was and the tabernacle was. And so as a result of that, they took the ark captive, and probably, and also we know that Eli died, his sons died. So that pretty much took care of the priesthood for a while. And they probably conquered the city itself and destroyed it, because we don't read about it anymore after that. And so that's who the Philistines are, and that's basically what they would do. And so after they had defeated Israel and had captured the ark, we start in chapter 5 and verse 1. And here's what it says. It says, "Now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. Then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. When the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. But when they arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. Therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who entered Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Now, the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them and smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territories. When the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is severe on us and on Dagon, our God." So they went and gathered all the lords of the Philistines to them and said, "What shall we do with the ark of God of Israel?" And they said, "Let the ark of God of Israel be brought around to Gath." And they brought the ark of the God of Israel around. After they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city with very great confusion, and he smote the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. So they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And as the ark of God came to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, saying, "They have brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people." They sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said, "Send away the ark of the God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, so that it will not kill us and our people." For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city. The hand of God was very heavy there, and the men who did not die were smitten with tumors, and the city and the cry of the city went up to heaven. And so we have this chapter here that talks to us about what happens when the Philistines took the ark. And the reason for this is because the Philistines might think, since they had what they referred to, or during that time, what they had was they had national gods, and that was each nation had its own god. And so if you became, for example, a Philistine, then you would adopt their god. If you became an Israelite, you would adopt their god. And so each nation had its own god. And so when your god would, or your nation would whip up on another nation, the assumption was that your God is stronger than their God. And so therefore, since the Philistines had whipped up on Israel and had captured the ark itself, they're thinking that their God is greater than the God of Israel. And so they took the symbol of the God of Israel, which was the Ark of the Covenant, and they put it inside the temple where their God was. And so let's read what happened. It says in verse 1, now the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it from Ebenezer to Ashdod. So they took it from where it had been captured, and they brought it to Ashdod. And Ashdod was the capital of the Philistine country, or the Philistine area. And it says, then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. Now Dagon was their god. And since they were a maritime nation, most scholars believe, and most archaeologists believe, that Dagon was basically a man with the head of a fish, and that was the god Dagon. And so it could be that the scriptures, the Bible itself, doesn't tell us exactly how Dagon looked, nor does it usually tell us how any of the false gods looked, but it does mention Dagon. Now, what's also interesting is that at one time, in the history of religion, the scholars, or the theologians, you might say, who were liberal and had liberal thinking, used the fact that the Philistines were mentioned as a proof that the Bible was just made up stories, that there was no nation known as the Philistines, that Israel just made it up so that they could look good. But what I want you to notice here is that in this particular story, they don't look good. Israel is not looking good. Israel fell to the Philistines. So that doesn't hold water. And the fact that the Philistines, they thought, was just this make-believe group of people has been debunked by archaeologists who have found artifacts and have found ruins and fossil remains that prove that the Philistines were actually a nation, and proves that they actually lived around the area where the Bible indicates that they lived. And so the Philistines then are now a proof of the fact that the Bible can be relied on, and the history of the Bible is historical and accurate. And so the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it and put it in the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. So they probably put it in there because they figured that their God had conquered the God of Israel. And so therefore they were putting it in there not only as a place to keep it, but also as an indication that their God was victorious. Now in verse 3, it says, when the Ashdodites, and by the way, an Ashdodite is just somebody who lives in Ashdod, that's the city where it was at. It says, when the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon, that's their God, had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And so basically what happens is that the next day, when the priests come in, the people come in to the temple, their temple, they notice that Dagon has fallen down in front of the ark of God. And so basically their God is paying homage to the God of Israel, and indicating that the reason that the Philistines took the ark wasn't because God is not powerful, but that there's another reason for it, and it's probably that God was punishing Israel because of their unfaithfulness, and God allowed them to be subjugated, and God allowed his ark to be captured. But he was still going to prove to the Philistines that he really is the God of gods and Lord of lords. And so when they came in, Ashdod was face down on the ground. And so what did they do? Well, they set him up. And the reason that they set him back up is because idols can't do anything. Idols don't move. In Isaiah 44, where it talks about idols, and it talks about them making idols and about them making it out of wood and different things, different items. It says in verse 17, it says, but the rest of it he makes into a god, his graven image, he falls down before it and worships. He also prays to it and says, deliver me, for you are my God. And they do not know, nor do they understand, for he has smeared over their eyes so that they cannot see, and their hearts so that they cannot comprehend. No one recalls, nor is there knowledge or understanding to say, I have burned half of it in the fire and also have baked bread over its coal. I roast meat and eat it. Then I make the rest of it into an abomination. I fall down before a block of wood. He feeds on ashes. A deceived heart has turned him aside, and he cannot deliver himself, nor say, is there not a lie in my hand? And so God points out that the idols themselves can't move, can't function, can't do anything for the people who make them, but they're basically statues made out of wood in that particular case. And no doubt in this one it was wood, or it was at least some kind of material that was manipulated by the hand of man. And so since Dagon isn't really alive, or doesn't really have any power, then Dagon himself, when he fell down, had to be raised up and set on his place again. In other words, Dagon has no power to do anything, not even extricate himself from the floor when the Lord caused him to fall before him. And it's interesting that in the story, you're going to notice that the children of Dagon, the children of the Philistines, they're going to realize the power of that's in the ark, and they're going to realize the power of the God of Israel, but they're not going to follow him, and that's because of their national inclinations and their national God. It's just like people in America today who don't believe in God because they're following the teachings and the dictates of the government when they institute evolution as the only alternative or the only idea of how life started on Earth. And so if you're a good American, then you follow that which you were taught and you hold to that tradition. And there's even many Christians who believe in evolution and yet claim to be Christians. And I find the two of them in contradistinction to one another, and you really can't hold one or hold the other. Either the Genesis account is true or it's not. And I'd suggest to you that it is true. But all I'm pointing out is that a nation has its presuppositions, and therefore, even when they see the power of Israel's God, they didn't change. And that's part of what Isaiah 44 and verse 17 through 20 was saying, that God covered their eyes over. And so their eyes are covered so that they don't even realize that their God isn't even a God. And that's pretty sad when that happens. And that's happened in our culture when it comes to evolution. The people who believe in evolution, they can't see that their message is really a lie, that it's not true, that we didn't evolve, but God created us the way that we are, and God created every animal and everything in the world. And so they can't see that Dagon is just an idol. So verse 4 it says, but when they arose early the next morning, so they went about their business, and the priest probably did what they usually do for Dagon, their god, during the day. And then the next morning, it says, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord, and the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold, and only the trunk of Dagon was left for him. So the next day when they arose, you had Dagon, who was their god, and this time he was on the ground, and this time his palms of his hands, in other words, his hand part were cut off, and so was his head. And so basically, God is showing them that Dagon can't think, he can't do anything, and he can't act with his hands. There's no life, there's no knowledge, there's no intellect in Dagon, and so therefore they shouldn't be following him. And he breaks his hands and his head on the threshold of the door. And so it seems that the idea is that if you're coming into the temple of Dagon, and you have to pass through the threshold, that you're coming into a place where there's not going to be anybody who can intellectually help you, nor are you coming to a place where the God will be able to serve you or be able to do anything for you, because he has no head and he has no hands. And so he fell down before God, and they only found the trunk of Dagon was left to him. And that's what they found. And so verse 5 says, therefore, neither the priests of Dagon nor all who enter Dagon's house tread on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. Now, a couple of things. When it says to this day, what that indicates is that the Philistines were around when this was written. If the Philistines weren't around when this was written, then he wouldn't have wrote to this day. he would have written he would have written something like, for a while they did it. But he says to this day. So the author of the book of Samuel is close to the actual events, and the Philistines are still around when he writes what he writes. And the other thing that I want you to notice is that it says that neither the priests of Dagon nor whoever entered the house would tread on the threshold. Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means that if you see a group of people doing something, then they're doing it because something happened, because there's a reason for them doing it. They don't do it just to do it. They're doing it because something happened. And so what that does is that proves that what is mentioned above actually happened. Because if it didn't happen, there's no reason for the priest to not step on the threshold when they enter the house of Dagon. But if during the history of the Philistines, as long as they existed, as long as they were serving Dagon and had a temple, they wouldn't step on the threshold, what that indicates is that the story was true, and therefore even the Philistines had the knowledge that the God of Israel was the true God and their God was a false God. And so that's one of the things that it shows us. That's one of the things that's being indicated by this little statement here, that they don't step on the threshold of the house of Dagon when they go in. And in verse 6, it says, now the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them and smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and his territory. Now, notice that here it says the hand of the Lord was heavy. So the difference between the hand of Dagon and the hand of the Lord was Dagon's hands were cut off because he couldn't do anything, but the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites. In other words, there is a God who acts. There is a God who does and moves in the world in which we live. And I want us to understand that God still moves in our world. God still does things in our world. God has not abandoned us to just some rules that he's given us, where God doesn't do anything for his people except figure out if they're going to just be faithful to his words. And so he doesn't help them in any other way, or doesn't do anything for them in any other way. No, God actually lives and moves and helps his people. He actually gives us the comfort that we need. He actually helps us in times of distress. God moves it in our world. Just like the hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, the hand of the Lord is gracious on his people. But here, the Lord's hand was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he ravaged them and smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and its territories. Now, I want you to think of something with me for just a second. How in the world did God do this? How in the world did these tumors come up? Did God's hand, for example, appear out of thin air and then all of a sudden touch somebody, and all of a sudden they have a tumor, and that's how they knew the Lord did it? And the answer is, of course not. The way they knew the Lord did it was because it was there, caused by the Lord. And the Lord doesn't have to actually be there. The Lord doesn't actually have to touch it. The Lord just says it, and it'll happen. And that's what Jesus was talking about when the centurion came to him and told him to come and heal his servant who was sick. And Jesus said, I'll go to your house. And the centurion says, no, I'm not worthy, but I'm a man of authority. Just say it and it'll happen. And that's the way God is. We don't have to see God's hand. We don't have to actually see a physical hand of God in order to know that God's doing what God promised. And so God is causing things to happen to these individuals by his hand. And he smote them with tumors, both Ashdod and his territories. And so he smote them with tumors. Now, some versions for this word tumor, they have the word hemorrhoids is what they have. And so we certainly understand what a hemorrhoid is, and it would cause the individuals not to be able to stand. And so it's certainly possible that maybe they were those kinds of tumors that were caused, and therefore they weren't able to sit before the Lord, but they had to stand before him, as was custom when you were serving the Lord. When you served the Lord, you always served him by standing. And so it's interesting that he gives them tumors. And if those tumors really were hemorrhoids, then all of the people are having to stand while God is around, because God is trying to teach them that he's the one that they serve. But anyway, that's interesting. And I think the word itself, let me look here for just a second. I think the word itself actually comes from that. Let's see if I can find it here. Doesn't look like anybody has that word. Yeah, it just says tumors. But I think, let me check something here. Nope. Okay, anyway, I can't find the actual word for it. So let me just go back here. All right. Verse 7 says, when the men of Ashdod saw that it was so, they said, the ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, for his hand is severe on us and on Dagon our God. So again, notice that this expression of his hand is being used as he is, as the Ashdodites, as the Philistines, recognize that God's doing stuff to them. And so therefore his hand is severe on us and on Dagon our God. So whose God is stronger? The Philistines' God or Dagon? The Philistines thought that, the Israelite God or the Philistine God? The Philistines thought their God was stronger because they captured Israel and they captured the ark. But God is showing them that he is stronger and that he really is the God. And he even shows them that by having his hand severe on the Philistines and on their God. So maybe other things were happening to that statue that aren't recorded, other than just the two things that we have mentioned. But they recognized that it was probably the hand of God. Now, they weren't 100% sure yet, but we're going to notice that they're certainly going to be convinced about it. Now, in verse 8, he says, so they sent and gathered all the lords of the Philistines to them and said, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord, of the God of Israel? And they said, let the ark of the God of Israel be brought around to Gath. And they brought the ark of the God of Israel around. Now, the reason they're doing this is because maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe that there's, something in the water, or maybe there's, some contaminant in their city that's causing them to have these tumors or these problems. And so it's not like they're absolutely sure that it's God's hand. Maybe it's just a bunch of bad circumstances that are going on. And so they're going to take it to Gath. They're going to take it to another city, and they're going to see what happens in that city. And so they took it and they sent it to Gath, and they brought it there. And it says in verse 9, let's see what happens there when they bring it to Gath, which, by the way, is another one of the major cities of the Philistine nation. Verse 9 says, after they had brought it around, the hand of the Lord was against the city with a very great confusion. And he smote the men of the city, both young and old, so that tumors broke out on them. And so it says again that when the ark was brought to the city and was in the city, that there was very great confusion. And again, he smote the men. Now notice that this one says he smote the men. Before, it just simply said that they had tumors, and that the men of Ashdod, he ravaged them. It says in verse 6, he ravaged them and smote them with tumors. So they had tumors. But here it points out that the tumors actually caused them to die, or that they died along with the plague of the tumors that were there. And there was this great confusion, and he smote the men of the city, both young and old. Now, I would suggest to you that there's very great confusion because the children of the Philistines don't know how to act with a real God. They don't understand how you serve a real God. They had their God, and so they could do pretty much whatever they wanted. And so there wasn't much confusion. But when you have a God who is causing things to happen in your city, then you want to know what to do in order to serve that God, or you want to know, what's going on or how to stop it or whatever. And so there's this great confusion that's going on, and there's this great confusion because they don't know God. And when you don't know God, it creates great confusion. It's kind of like today in the culture in America, where we're having all this gender confusion stuff that's going on, where individuals are allowed to pick their own gender. And so you don't just have boys and girls and individuals who are homosexual or heterosexual. Now you have individuals who are binary, or you have individuals who don't claim to be any gender at all whatsoever. And so the country is in confusion. There's some individuals and there's some places that want to take out all of the masculine and feminine pronouns so they can talk to people. And just think of what kind of confusion that would cause. When you look at somebody, do you call it it? Do you call it a him or her? What in the world do you do? How does that affect our language? Not to mention, how does that affect relationships with one another? And so when you leave God, you create all kinds of confusion. And since since the Philistines didn't know how to function with a real God, a God who actually worked in their life and who actually did things, then they were in great confusion. And so it says, and as a result of that, it says, he, God, smote the men of the city. So God would smite or kill the men of the city, both young and old. And he smote them so that tumors broke out on them. So they had tumors on them. And it didn't matter if you were young, it didn't matter if you were old, you had tumors that broke out on you. The activity that is caused by adults and individuals who know right from wrong is going to affect children, is going to affect those who don't know right from wrong. It's going to affect them, and it's going to create problems for them as well. And so these tumors didn't just break out on the men, it also broke out on their children, because that's the result of the activity of these men not knowing how to function with God or how to deal with God. And so they broke out with tumors. And so this is the second city where it happened, and people died. And in 1 Samuel 5 and verse 10, it says, so they sent the ark of God to Ekron. And as the ark of God came to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, saying, they have brought the ark of the God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people. They sent, therefore, and gathered all the lords of the Philistines. So when it came to the third city, by this time they knew that the problems that were being caused with the tumors and the men being smitten by the tumors, that was an act of the ark of the covenant of God. They knew it. They realized it. They put two and two together. And so therefore they knew that the God of Israel was a God who worked in the lives of men. But it's interesting that they didn't fall down and worship him or serve him. They still kept their national God because they were Philistines. And so they weren't giving up on their national God, Dagon. And so it says that so when they brought it to Ekron, the Ekronites cried out, they have brought the ark of God of Israel around to us to kill us and our people. And so they were afraid that what happened in Gath and what happened in Ashdod was going to happen there with them when the ark came. So everybody knew and everybody understood that the problems that were happening was because of the ark and because of of God's hand on them. And remember that. And that suggests to you that's why Dagon's hands and his head were cut off, because he can't think or do anything and he can't act. But God can. God thinks, God acts, God functions, and therefore he does things. And he's doing things to the Ekronites and the Gathites and the Ashdodites in order to prove to them that just because God allowed them to capture the ark doesn't mean that God is not the God of the Lord of Lords. Now, it says in verse 11 that they had to figure out what to do with this ark. So they decided what to do with it because Ekron didn't want it. And it says they sent and therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it return to its own place so that it will not kill us and our people. For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city. The hand of God was very heavy there. And so again, notice that the hand of the Lord was heavy. God acts with his hands. And so God had proven that Dagon can't act. Dagon can't function. He has no hands or the ability to do stuff with his hands, but God can. And so they decided that what they're going to do is they're going to send the ark away. Now they gathered the lords of the Philistines. Now there's the lords of the Philistines would be the 5 lords of the 5 major cities of the Philistine nation that were there in the land of Israel, or the land that Israel was supposed to conquer. And there were these 5 major cities, and so they each had their lord, and those are the lords that are under consideration here. And so they gather them together and they say, what should we do? What do you want to do about this? And somebody said, well, send away the ark of the God of Israel and let it return to its own place so that it will not kill us and our people. So they know that the cause of their death and the cause of their plague is the people. And it says, for there was a deadly confusion throughout the city, and the hand of God was very heavy there. So individuals were dying as a result of these plagues or these tumors or whatever that God had caused to come upon them. And it says in verse 12, and the men who did not die were smitten with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So men were dying, and those men that didn't die, they suffered with tumors. So the men that weren't killed, they had to stand. If those tumors were hemorrhoids, those individuals had to stand before God as long as the ark was there, present in their city, because you can't sit down. It's very uncomfortable if you have those kinds of problems. And so the men that weren't killed, the other men were plagued with tumors. Now, let's see what they're going to do. Beginning in chapter 6 and verse 1, and we'll read a couple of verses and then come back and talk about it. It says, now the ark of the Lord had been in the country of the Philistines 7 months, and the Philistines called for the priests and the diviners and called for the priests and for the diviners, saying, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we shall send it to its place. And they said, if you send away the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it empty, but you shall surely return to him a guilt offering. Then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand is not removed from you. Then they said, what shall be the guilt offering which we shall return to him? And they said, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines, for 1 plague was on all of you and on your lords. And so you shall make likenesses of your tumors and likenesses of your mice that ravage the land, and you shall give glory to the God of Israel. Perhaps he will ease his hand from you, your gods, and your land. Now we're going to stop there and go ahead and just talk about this for just a minute as we consider what's going on here. And as we do, we learn some things. We learn a few more things about this plague that's under consideration. We learn a few more things about this plague that's under consideration. And as we do, let me hide this thing here. And as we do, realize that the events that we're talking about happened over a period of 7 months. So there's a great deal of distress and a great deal of problems that were going on as these events were happening. Verse 1 says the ark of the Lord had been in the country of the Philistines for 7 months. So these things happened within a 7-month period. And so it wasn't like over years and years that this happened, but it was fairly quick. And therefore, that's how they knew it was the problems came from God and having the ark. Now, verse 2 says, and the Philistines called the priests and the diviners, saying, what shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us how we shall send it to its place. So they called their priests, because they had priests and they had diviners, people who were soothsayers and those kind of individuals. And so they called them and they wanted to know how to send it away, what they should do, since they considered the Ark of the Covenant a relic of God. They called the priests, in order to figure out how to do this, because the priests would be religious individuals, and they called diviners because they would be spiritual-minded individuals who had a connection with the spirit world, which supposedly is where God's at. And so therefore they call the individuals who would be experts in those areas. They call the priests and the diviners. And it says, and they asked him, what shall we do with the ark? How should we send it away? Now verse 3 says, and they, the priests and the diviners, said, if you send away the ark of the God of Israel, do not send it empty, but you shall surely return to him a guilt offering. So what they advised was that if you're sending this ark back, then you better not send it back empty. In other words, without any kind of apology. The idea of sending it back empty is the idea of not learning anything, of not rendering to God what is due a God. And so therefore, when you insult a God, you certainly want to pay them or give them something, to apologize for what it is that you've done. A lot of times they would offer children, or they would offer virgins in apology to the gods for their offense to them. And so that's what these priests are basically saying. That's how you deal with the deities of the spirit world, is that you have to apologize to them, and you have to give them something. And that's why it says, but you shall surely return him a guilt offering. In other words, what you did and the activity that you did is wrong, and therefore you're guilty of a crime, and so therefore you should pay, and you have to give them something in order to pay. And certainly the Old Testament talks about guilt offerings, and when we sin, we owe God our life. And that's why in the Old Testament they sacrificed animals for their guilt offerings, because the animal was a representation of the coming of Jesus, who paid for their crime. And so this guilt offering is an attempt to pray for their crime, their offense to a God. And so that's what the priests and the diviners said, who should be the experts for speaking about spiritual things. And it says, and they said, then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand is not removed from you. And so basically, they're saying that if you do these things, God will more than likely heal you, and his hand will be removed from you, and he will help you. And the reason that his hand hasn't been removed from you is because you haven't apologized to him, because you haven't given him a guilt offering. And so that's what that's referring to when it says, then you will be healed, and it will be known to you why his hand is not removed from you. When you apologize to God, then God will be gracious to you. That's what gods were supposed to do. When you apologize to them, they're supposed to be gracious to you, and his hand would be removed from them. But his hand hasn't been removed from them because they haven't apologized to him, or they haven't recognized him or given him his guilt offering. Now, they now have to figure out what are they going to give him. Verse 4, it says, then they said, what shall be the guilt offering which we shall return to him? And they said, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines, for one plague was on all of you and on your lords. And so what the priests and the diviners decided in an attempt to try to figure out how to appease God was they said, well, apparently he's been plaguing them with tumors, and he's been plaguing them with mice. And so therefore offer him 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice. In other words, one tumor for every lord, and one mouse for every lord, that's made of solid gold. And I don't know how big these were. I'm not sure. Remember, gold is extremely valuable. So even if the mouse was a pound, that would be a lot of money during that day and time. And so they're giving they're offering to God something that's valuable to them, and they figured out the shape would be the shape of the plagues that were coming upon them. Now, I'm not sure, other than the fact that those are the plagues that are on them, why it is that they chose mice and tumors, but that's what they chose. And let's see what happens. And it says, in the second part of verse 4, it says, and they said, 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, according to the number of the lords of the Philistines. For one plague was on all of you and on your lords. So the plague was tumors and mice, and somehow these mice created problems. And I heard one individual claim that maybe it was the bubonic plague because that comes from rats and from rodents. And so maybe that's what was happening to them. And certainly that's true. And certainly mice and rats and rodents bring all kinds of disease and problems. And so that's part of how they were dying and what was going on. All right, so they're gonna send back five golden tumors and 5 golden rats in order to appease the God who they have angered. Okay, now it says in verse 6, it says, why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their heart when he had severely dealt with them? Did they not allow the people to go? And they departed. Now, therefore, take and prepare a new cart and 2 milch cows on which there has never been a yoke, and hitch the cows to the cart and take their calves home away from them. Take the ark of the Lord and put it on the cart, and put the articles of gold which you return to him as a guilt offering in a box by its side. Then send it away that it may go. Watch if it goes up by the way of its own territory to Bethshemesh, then he has done us this great evil. But if not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by chance. All right, so in this section, what we have is we have the priest having to persuade the people. Now, it's interesting that the priest says that in verse 6. He says, why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians and Pharaoh hardened their hearts? Now, why would they want to harden their hearts? Well, because the idea of having the ark is the idea of them conquering the God of Israel. But if they send the ark back, then it means that they didn't conquer it, that they didn't win, that they weren't victorious over it, that God allowed them to be victorious over it. And so they were kind of stubborn in getting rid of the ark, apparently. And so therefore the priests had to encourage them and remind them of what happened in Egypt. Now, remember that what happened in Egypt and what happened with Pharaoh was it was over 400 years has gone by. And yet the story of the Egyptians and the story of Pharaoh and the plagues that God brought on them was still circulating the world, and it still is today. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why God hardened Pharaoh's heart, because he wanted people to remember that story forever and ever. And so it's being told from generation to generation, even for people who aren't religious. Everybody knows about the 10 plagues, and everybody knows about Moses, and everybody knows about the parting of the Red Sea, and everybody knows all of those events. And so here also, the Philistines know these events. And so the priests are saying, why in the world are you guys doing what Pharaoh did when he hardened his heart? And God was punishing them and bringing on them plagues. Let this ark go. It didn't. God's hand was on Pharaoh and the Egyptians until they let the people go. So let the cart go. That's basically the assumption that's being made. As long as you're keeping the ark, God's hand is going to be on you. So let the ark go and let it go back to where it belongs. And he says, and so it says in verse 7, now therefore take and prepare a new cart and two milch cows on which there has never been a yoke. Now, what that means is that as they're getting, as they're getting ready to send this ark back, they're still not 100% sure that the ark is creating these problems. And so what they're going to do is they're going to take the ark, or they're going to take the ark, and they're going to put it on a cart. They're going to attach it to 2 milk cows. In other words, these cows aren't cows that just give milk, but these are cows that just had calves. And just having calves, they would want to take care of their calves by feeding them and giving, and letting them have milk and nurse. And so they're gonna take these calves and they're gonna put them in a different place, and they're gonna take these cows and they're gonna hook them up to the wagon, and the cows are gonna want to go to their babies. They're gonna want to go to the calves in order to take care of them and in order to feed them. And so they're doing this to make sure that the ark really was the problem and that God really is manipulating and acting in their world. And so if the cart with these cows, who, by the way, have never been harnessed before, in other words, they don't know how to pull, they've never been trained on which way to go and what to do. If you put a yoke on cows, they're just going to stand there. You're going to have to teach them what to do. And so that's this idea. So they're doing everything they can to make it difficult for the ark by itself to get to where it's going, unless God is actually manipulating and causing the things to happen. And that's why you see them saying to get this ark and put on a new cart with these cows that have babies, and take their babies away from them, hook them up to a yoke, even though they've never been yoked before, and hitch the cows to the cart and take their calves away from them. It says, take the ark of the Lord and place it on the cart, and put the articles of gold which you return to him as a guilt offering in a box by its side. Then send it away that it may go. And so basically they're going to put the ark on top of the new cart. By the way, notice that they have a new cart. So they have a sense of respect, and they have a sense of you do something special with deity. You don't just treat deity as an ordinary individual and just stick him on an old cart. You have to get a new cart for God. And so they had a sense of the divine, is what they had a sense. They had a sense of the divine. They just didn't know how God wanted them to function. Now, what's interesting is that how did they get the cart? How did they get the Ark of the Covenant off the original cart and put into the house of Dagon? And how did they move it from the house of Dagon to other places, to the other cities? And because God had told the Israelites that the only people who could move it without dying were Levites. Now, if you want to, you can assume, or you can say that maybe the Philistines had captured some Levites and they made the Levites move the ark. But I don't really think that's what happened. I think what you have happening here is God is accommodating their knowledge, and God is accommodating and allowing them to touch the ark for bringing about his purposes. See, what we need to remember is that God's laws are like all laws, and that is that God's laws have a general, they're generally given for the good of people. They're generally given for the good of what's happening. But God can make exceptions with those laws when necessary. That's what our Good Samaritan laws are about. If, for example, if somebody has an automobile wreck, and you're the first one on the scene, and you're not licensed to be a doctor, the law says that you can't practice medicine, because you can't practice medicine, are you going to let that person die? And so the idea is, no, you're going to do what you can, even though you're not a licensed doctor. And if you make a mistake, they're going to forgive you for it, and they're not going to hold you accountable to the law, because an exception needs to be made. And that suggests to you that that's what's going on here, that God is making this exception and allowing them to touch the ark or lift the ark or do whatever they need to do with the ark in order to move it around and get it in the carts, so that God can demonstrate who he is to them. that's what I think you have going on here, because we have the story, and therefore the story will be an indication of the power of God, just like Egypt and the Philistines. And so it says in verse 9, so they sent the ark away. In other words, by sending the ark away, that simply means that everybody got away from the ark, and they let the ark go wherever it was going to go. They let the cows wander wherever they were going to wander. Now, most cows would wander to where their babies are, even though they might be, attached to something that they're dragging. Milk's cows would want to go where their babies are, and so they're going to watch and see where they go. And it says, "Watch." Verse 9, watch if it goes up by the way of its own territory to Beth-shemesh, then he has done us this great evil. But if not, then we will know that it was not his hand that struck us. It happened to us by chance. And so there's the full understanding. Here's how they're going to know for sure one way or another. They're going to know if these cows, go off to Israel and go to the route to go to Israel and leave their calves and pull the ark, then they're going to know that God's the one who's controlling the ark. And they're going to know that everything that happened to them for the last 7 months was caused by God. And so they're going to understand all that. And so that's the reason why they're doing this. So they're watching the ark to see what happens. So they're going to figure this out for sure one way or another. Verse 10 says, then the men did so and took 2 milch cows and hitched them to the cart and shut up their calves at home. They put the ark of the Lord on the cart and the box with the golden mice and its likenesses of their tumors. And the cows took the straight way in the direction of Beth-shemesh. They went along the highway, lowing as they went, and did not turn aside to the right or to the left. And the lords of the Philistines followed them to the border of Beth-shemesh. Now, the people of Beth-shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, and they raised their eyes and saw the ark and were glad to see it. And so we're going to stop there for just a second and cover this little part here. So the Philistines, having taken the advice of the priests, did exactly what they were told to do. It says in verse 10 that the men did so. In other words, did what the priests and the diviners told them to do. So they took the 2 milk cows and hitched them to a cart, and they shut the calves at home, and they put the ark of the Lord on the cart and the box with the tumors and the mice, and they sent it away. And it says in verse 12, and the cows took a straight way in the direction of Beth-shemesh, and they went along the highway, lowing as they went. So as soon as they got everything ready and put the ark on the cart, and they hitched the calves and they put the tumors up there, the golden tumors and the golden mice or rats up there on the ark, and they, I guess they backed away from the ark, or they backed away from the cart. It headed straight as could be to the land of Israel, to the closest border, which would be Beth-shemesh. That they went straight course. They didn't turn to the right, they didn't turn to the left, but as they're going, they're lowing. In other words, they're moving because they're calling for their babies. They want their babies, but yet God is directing them to go straight ahead and to take the cart back to where it belongs. And so that's what you have here. And it says, and the Lord of the Philistines followed them to the border of Beth-shemesh. So the people were following the cart. They weren't leading it, they were following it. So there was no way that the cows knew which way to go, because nobody was in front of them. Nobody was directing them or even giving them the idea of which way to go. They were being led directly by God. And the Philistine lords were following the cart to see where it was going to go and where it ended up. Now, verse 13. It says, now the people of Beth-shemesh were reaping their wheat harvest in the valley, And they raised their eyes and saw the ark and were glad to see it. And the cart came into the field of Joshua, the Bethshemite, and stood there where there was a large stone. And they split the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was with it, in which were the articles of gold, and put them on the large stone. And the men of Bethshemesh offered burnt offerings and sacrifices that day to the Lord. And when the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they returned to Ekron that day. Now, verse 13. So as the ark is coming into the city or the area of Bethshemesh, the people were out in the fields reaping, because generally when you had a city, you had around the edge of the city, you would have the fields that would be sown and harvested. And I guess it was the wheat harvest. And so they were out there in the wheat harvest. And so as they see the milk cows coming, pulling this cart, they see the ark. And so it comes and it stops, it rests by a stone. And they were glad to see it, but it comes and it rests by a stone. In verse 14 says, the ark came into the field of Joshua, the Bethshemite, and stood there where there was a large stone. And they split the wood of the cart and offered the cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. And so the cows came straight over to this field. It was Joshua's field, which is interesting because the word Joshua is the same word for Jesus in Greek. And so it came to the house of Joshua, and there was a large stone there, which also is interesting because Jesus is the stone of the rock. And then they split the wood of the cart, and they offered the cows as a burnt offering. And so they offered this burnt offering to the Lord that they were offering. And at verse 15 says, the Levites took down the ark of the Lord and the box that was in it. So the children of Israel knew the procedure for handling the ark. And so the Levites were the ones who took it down and were the ones who would handle the ark. So Israel knew who and what was supposed to be done with the ark and who was supposed to take care of it. And so that they take it down. And they put it on the large stone. So they take the Ark of the Covenant and they put it on the stone. And I think that's interesting because, like I said, Jesus is the rock, and Jesus is our covenant. He becomes our covenant for us, and he's going to die for us. And so you have these cows that are offered on this stone, and they offered the cows, and they made a burnt offering to the Lord. Now, it says in verse 16, when the 5 lords of the Philistines saw it, they returned to Ekron that day. So they were convinced that it was that God was the cause of the things that happened to them, and they understood those things. And so the lords went back to their own country, realizing that the reason that they had defeated Israel wasn't because they were stronger, their God was stronger, but because God allowed them to defeat Israel because Israel had been sinning. And so in verse 17 it says, these are the golden tumors which the Philistines returned for the guilt offering to the Lord. One from Ashdod, one from Gaza, one from Ashkelon, one from Gath, and one from Ekron. And the golden mice, according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines belonging to the 5 lords, both of fortified cities and of country villages, the large stone on which they set the ark of the Lord is a witness to this day in the field of Joshua the Bethshemite. He struck down some of the men of Bethshemesh because they had looked into the ark of the Lord. He struck down of all the people 50,070 men, and the people mourned because the Lord had struck the people with a great slaughter. Then the men of Bethshemesh said, who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? And to whom shall we go up from us? And to whom shall he go up from us? So they sent messengers to the inhabitants of Kiriath Jearim, saying, the Philistines have brought back the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you. And so we have the counting in verse 16 and 17 of the guilt offering. So there was 5 golden tumors from the Philistines of Ashdod and of the 5 cities of the Philistines. And then it says in verse 18 that there was golden mice according to the number of all the cities of the Philistines. So there wasn't just 5 mice, there was a golden mouse for every city of the Philistines that they occupied, was offered to the Lord on that day. And the idea of the large stone on which they set the Ark of the Covenant as a witness to this day, again, indicates that the author that's writing is there and knows the exact stone, and that stone is there and it hasn't been removed or taken away or nothing's been built over it, but the stone is still there. All right, we're going to go ahead and stop there at verse 18. We'll pick up verse 19 and talk about why it is that God killed all these people at Bethshemesh. So we're here at verse 18, and we'll start at verse 19 next week. We pray the Lord's blessed you for being here. We pray that he continues to bless you. We pray that you keep learning and growing in Jesus.